You know what's weird? An entire generation got told they were special, then worked harder than anyone expected, and somehow ended up unable to afford the same life that seemed completely normal just one generation earlier.
That's a psychology experiment nobody signed up for. I'm talking about millennials, people born between 1981 and 1996. Wait, what? Before you roll your eyes, stay with me, because this gets uncomfortable in ways you probably haven't thought about. Millennials became the first generation in modern American history expected to be worse off financially than the generation before them. The Pew Research Center confirmed this back in 2020, which means we've got an entire demographic walking around with this bizarre psychological cocktail of achievement and failure mixed together in their heads every single day. Imagine being told your whole childhood that you could be anything, win anything, achieve anything, and then graduating into a recession where the participation trophy suddenly becomes a master's degree.
That costs more than a house used to. The psychological term for this is cognitive dissonance, and millennials are basically swimming in it.
I used to think I had it all figured out. But the world feels a lot heavier now. Called Generation Me studying this exact phenomenon. She found that millennials score higher on narcissism scales than previous generations. But, and this is the part that'll mess with you, they also score higher on anxiety and depression, a generation that simultaneously thinks they're special and feels completely worthless. A trauma response with a LinkedIn profile. Think about the actual timeline here for a second.
Millennials were the test subjects for every parenting trend that came out of the self-esteem movement in the 80s and 90s.
Helicopter parents, everyone gets a trophy, you're smart just for existing. These weren't bad intentions, they were earnest attempts at better parenting, based on the psychology available at the time. Then millennials hit their 20s right as the economy imploded in 2008. Graduated into a job market that had fundamentally changed, and suddenly found themselves navigating a completely different economic reality
than the one they'd been prepared for. The whiplash alone should have hospitalized people. And social media, millennials got that right in their formative years.
Not as kids like Gen Z, but as teenagers and young adults when their identities were still forming. Facebook launched in 2004, Instagram in 2010. That means millennials learned how to be adults while simultaneously learning how to perform their lives for an audience.
When I look back at that time, it feels almost surgical in its precision. But the impact, the emotional impact, that's what stayed with me.
Which is literally what social media trains you to do. They're mental health tanks. You're essentially running a 24/7 campaign for your own existence.
And the polls never close. Now pile on the fact that millennials are delaying or completely skipping the traditional life milestones.
That used to give people a sense of adult identity. Marriage, home ownership, having kids. Surveys show they absolutely want these things.
But the economic reality makes them borderline impossible without family wealth or extraordinary luck. So you've got people in their 30s and 40s
who still feel like they're waiting for their real life to start. Except the waiting room is a studio apartment that costs $2,200 a month.
And their therapist is booked until March. The impact of prolonged uncertainty is surprisingly well documented.
When achieving the markers of what society defines as adulthood becomes unattainable, your brain doesn't just shrug and move on.
Instead, it creates this low-level stress that's referred to as allostatic load, your body's tendency to prepare for something that never actually comes.
Sort of like being stuck in the loading screen of your own life. And when you look at the progress bar, you see it hasn't moved an inch.
Millennials were sold a very specific story. Effort equals success. But let me throw something at you that might feel a tad more personal. About how effort equals outcome. Study hard, go to college, get a good job, work your way up. That social contract seemed pretty straightforward.
And honestly, it had worked for a long time. Except the economic landscape shifted in ways that nobody really anticipated.
When millennials showed up ready to follow that path, they found that college now costs 10 times what it used to. Entry-level jobs require 5 years of experience, and here's $80,000 in debt and a gig economy where you're an independent contractor, with no benefits. The psychological term for when reality fundamentally violates your core beliefs about how the world works is schema disruption. And when it happens on a generational scale, you don't just get disappointed people, you get a complete rewiring of how an entire age group relates to institutions, authority, and the concept of a stable future. which explains why millennials are often characterized as both idealistic and deeply cynical.
At the same time, they still believe things should be fair, they just no longer believe they will be. Pattern recognition in action. And the job work thing? Oh man, millennials get absolutely roasted for job hopping and not being loyal to companies. You know what's psychologically fascinating about that criticism? Corporate America fundamentally changed the employment relationship over the past few decades. Pensions disappeared, full-time positions became contract work, mass layoffs became normalized business strategy. Millennials didn't invent this lack of loyalty. They just adapted to an employment landscape that had already changed. A completely rational response to an environment that treats workers as interchangeable. However, this is something that is not often talked about enough. Millennials are also one of the most educated generations in history, and the most diverse. When defining them, the first thing that comes to mind is teen internet culture. They grew up with the internet. This creates a very specific psychological profile, one who questions everything because they've seen the many versions of truth. People who interrogate the status quo often get labeled as entitled or difficult, but critical thinking meeting systems that were never designed to be questioned will look like that. The mental health conversation is different for millennials. They're the first generation to widely destigmatize therapy
and actually talk about anxiety and depression like real things instead of character flaws. That's massive, except they're doing it while living in conditions
that are objectively more stressful, with student debt levels that would have been unthinkable before, housing costs that have outpaced wage growth,
and job insecurity baked into the modern economy. So it creates this weird dynamic where they're simultaneously self-aware and more overwhelmed.
And can we talk about the future for a second? Because millennials are also the generation that gets to watch the planet actively deteriorate, while being told that they're the ones who need to fix it, despite having comparatively less institutional power and resources to actually do anything. At the scale required, existential dread with a side of helplessness. Climate anxiety is a legitimate psychological phenomenon now.
and millennials are right in the crosshairs. So what you've got is a generation shaped by impossibly high expectations, economic instability,
Constant performance pressure, delayed adulthood, and a front row seat to multiple overlapping crises. And society looks at them and goes, "Why are you so anxious, and why can't you just buy a house?" The psychology of millennials becomes incredibly predictable when you look at what they've been through. They're responding exactly how humans respond when the landscape shifts beneath them, and the map they were given no longer matches the territory. If this hit home for you, please subscribe. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit that join button to become a channel member. I would genuinely appreciate your support.